Okay, so we're going to go over the need for public transportation with a huge emphasis on need. Um, so it all depends a lot on young adults, and the big focus here is going to be on the next generation, and we're going to start about why that's so important by looking back at the past. So a lot of my argument is going to be focused on what I learned watching Ellen Emmerich's video and then doing research into a lot of the same things she did. So I want to start off with an image that is pretty telling of Dayton, Ohio, where we see how spaced out the focus of public transportation is, and that's a microcosm of the big issue around the country, and it's only going to kind of grow from there. So, how we got here, and from probably one of the best researchers who examines all this stuff and has a lot of current, past, and plans for the future information they can find on the public um, improvements that can be made through an improvement to public transportation. Um, Heaps has a pretty good quote here that talks about how discriminatory and just kind of messed up the reason that we have such a focus on privatized vehicles, and a lot of it comes from originally wanting to have more of a focus on trains, and because at the time that was the thing for public transportation, abilities to walk, and just more of an equal way to get people around and have more of an equal spread of living conditions and space around the country instead of having wide open rural areas, cities, separating suburbs from everything, and obviously a lot of the discriminatory aspects of our society stem from a lot of those things, and those were all supported through automobile industries backing privatized vehicles over public transportation, which is why we have such a weird highway system. There's been constant changes to how streets are focused on, but a lot of this is built into our country's legislation and our just physical structure, and that's obviously something that's very hard to change, but something that needs to change because there was a seed planted and it's kind of grown into what our issues are nowadays. Um, right here, I want to use was a study done in China. I think it's a great example because obviously a lot of these issues can be isolated to the U.S., but they're not just our problems. Other countries suffer from these same things, have same issues because they followed in the footsteps of other countries. They were affected by other countries who implemented these changes, or they just have certain areas. It's a complex problem, so it's not easy to have good public transportation everywhere. There are great examples, there are bad examples, and in China, this was research done that's similar to a lot of the research done here, but it was on large scales and done in very different areas that showed the direct correlation between improvement in life and improvement of public transportation. And it was done over a pretty decent period. I mean, it's a decade in the 2000s where a lot of changes happen, technology-wise especially. Um, so to put more emphasis on the fact that we're a big country, obviously, I like to focus on SEPTA. They're a great example of good public transportation. That used to be very, very bad. And that's a good example of how we've changed a lot of things, but they're still isolated. There's better examples in the country. There's worse examples because I'm showing Dayton again. I mean, there's been improvements done there, and Dayton is far from the worst as well. And that doesn't say anything bad about the areas. That just shows that there needs to be improvement in how it's putting the people that live far away from those spots at a disadvantage. But SEPTA is a good example of an outlier because they made the improvements and they got the community's voice heard. And that's why they're getting better and they're continuing to get better in Pennsylvania. So there's a disparity between quality and also just the equality of how condensed the areas are, and then some spaced out areas where you don't have it. And it's hard to focus in our country, but it's something that should be done, and that's what we're getting to is how people need to understand that they need to push for this because it's a localized issue. It's a good map to look at that in a secondary so you can see how spaces that are away from there have it worse off than spaces that are close. Won't try to focus on that too long. But right here is what's really important because a lot of times people will say, oh, well, the reason the public transportation there is better is because it was already better in those spots, so they put the public transportation in the areas that have better workers, more people, better living to eat, like so on and so on, which is just not true. There's a disparity in between certain areas. You can see how there's top third and bottom third in tight-knit areas, but you do have your spaced out spots that are being neglected, but you also have spaced out spots that have good sections where cities and things like that are. But the biggest thing to focus on is that quality of life tends to follow where the emphasis has been put. Or you have cities that have already had that, but you're seeing a large contrast inside these tight areas, and that's where the problems come from. So the benefits themselves are as complex problems. There's a lot of health benefits, but on the large scale, you're going to have economic growth and community improvement. It's pretty easy to see that people can get to work, or if they're feeling better every day and living happier lives, that's going to help. So it's better for businesses and community prospects if everyone's doing well. It also stops the focus on overpricing housing so that people want to live closer to those areas, same as they would want to live close to school districts, or also all the money going into certain areas. It's the same as voicing yourself for like living conditions. On the small scale, youth health, work life, family relationships. Youth health is a huge one because you want people being out and active and having the space to do that. You want them also to have the ability to go out and do things and want to, because it's big for mental health because you're more closely connected to people, and not every day is wondering how do I get to and from, and wasting time on that. You're going to save money on vehicles and have more reliable prospects for transportation because you're not spending all your money on your car. It might not break down on you. It's their job to make sure that you have reliable public transportation, or you have things such as sidewalks to get yourself around, or relying on a bike because you can ride a bike on a sidewalk. But another huge thing, a lot of people have used cars. If they have a new car, it's a good backup. A couple days without a car can be huge, especially if you have certain jobs and you're dependent paycheck to paycheck. It may seem little, but those can be life-changing. To go back to HEAPS, because a lot of the research is done and focused on her work, and it's fantastic, and there's a lot of current benefits of public transportation, but the history shows how what we implement now can have the same effect as what they implemented back then. It has now basically taken over and become a system, is to start a whole new system. So it's going to get your voice heard at your state level, because a lot of this is locally done. That's who decides how public transportation works. And getting it implemented at a national level, it puts the power back in the people's hands, in the hands of the youth. It gives you a legitimate voice, so that's a true representation of freedom and equality, instead of the kind of constructed system version of an American idea of having privatized vehicles and all this stuff that actually ends up being discriminatory and problematic. The environment's another huge thing to consider. The air pollution, energy required, a lot of that stuff's huge, but one of the biggest things is less waste. You're not having $20,000 cars being built and then called obsolete and people need to purchase new ones, or used cars that are breaking down constantly. You're having good quality materials made because they need to last, because the people who are building them want them to last and are also maintaining them for the public. So it's less of this. So we're getting into subsidies, so we want to steer clear of this chart. We want to have more of an equal spread among these things and quality, and focus on the fact that a lot of people want to say, oh, the taxes are the biggest issue. You're still spending a ton of money with privatized vehicles. You may not see it. It may be easier to argue that you're not, but that's how it's working. So also the big thing is we want to say, care for your fellow person, even if it's not directly affecting you because you have a private vehicle and it's not a huge deal for you. But people always want to bring up taxes and other things, so think about that. You're spending money one way or another. This is going to help you, and that's another way you can look at it: what it costs you, what it costs society. So here's a nice little area. I've been here. I thought it was an easy way to look at because they have a lot of walkways, public transportation, and also just easier access for your private vehicles, because this isn't about getting rid of private vehicles, but having more equality and improvement of quality with a lot of the things that you use. And that is what I use. 3 main sources in this, and that is what they talk about repeatedly, is about having everything working together and taking a complex problem and simplifying it, because it was made complex with the seed that was planted, and we're just trying to rework it back the other way. And that's about it. Thanks.